Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. Here are 10 lessons from the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Among the many things that you could possibly take away, here are 10 that I felt were impactful for myself as well as the other people who I attended with. First, the way that the museum documented the price of slavery is just unprecedented. I mean, being able to have information and data on how much a slave cost over time, to have information on how much a slave would pick cotton for a year and how much that would be cost, and how much it would cost to actually sell and lease slaves. I mean, that was extremely profound. Actually documenting the role that indentured servitude played and the fact that there were rebellions in the early to mid 1600s consisting of blacks as well as whites, all of whom were there for indentured servitude. After some of these rebellions, whites were given a different deal from blacks. Whites were given a deal to actually become part of to become part of the capitalism process that was slavery, that was blackness as collateral, and that is what it became at that particular time. As we went from not just having slavery, because people are like, we've always had slavery, well, of course, but as Dr. Tukufu Zuberi from UPenn notes, the racialization of slavery is what makes American slavery and the slave trade unique. And that is what was documented at the museum. Second, the number of rebellions that happened among black slaves is something that I felt was pretty profound. I mean, as a sociologist, I know about most of these rebellions, but I think most people don't. I think there's this perception that some kind of way that slaves were just being passive in terms of their internment, in terms of being slaves, and that could be further from the truth. Instead, there were tons of rebellions, even outside of Nat Turner's rebellion. And I mean, there were several that went on, and some of these actually involved working class whites. Not many, but some did. And that leads to the third point, is that the brutality that occurred during slavery is not what Bill O'Reilly talks about, where they had a home and they had a good place to stay. Man, that's bullcrap. Slavery was hell, right? And people actively fought against it in many ways. Now, the response to that activism and empowerment oftentimes led to heinous and public forms of death. So the brutality that came through in the museum, even outside of showing too many heinous images, I mean, it was just quite profound in terms of seeing the number of people who were killed during these rebellions. Fourth, the progress made during Reconstruction, where over 1,000 blacks were elected to public office. And then all of a sudden we had convict leasing and Jim Crow laws put in place. See, this is the level of progress that was happening between about 1865 and 1877 that a lot of people just don't know about. So looking at that period of time, which was one of the only periods in human history or in American history where we weren't necessarily seeing the persecution of blacks in the way that it was during slavery and Jim Crow, because it wasn't peachy during Reconstruction, but it was progress. And we saw that actually reversed. The fifth thing is the prominence of women in the museum. I was extremely happy to see this, because historically, black women in particular have not got their due for all the things that they've done throughout not just American history, but throughout human history. Emmett Till's mother was one that was quite prominent in the museum. As one of the main exhibits was seeing the casket of Emmett Till. And I mean, that just gives me chills even now. I mean, I will never forget seeing that casket and what happened to Emmett Till's body for looking at a white woman in the Deep South. And I mean, these are the troubling things that actually happens to black people. The sixth thing was the prominence of black military service. I've said this before, on average, just based on the percentage in the population, blacks are actually more likely to serve in the military. So these arguments about blacks being anti-American, I mean, just simply does not hold water. And there was actually a wing dedicated to military service, in particular showing individuals who had won a Medal of Honor and Distinction. And that was quite profound. Seventh, the debunking of racial, or more so black, inferiority was put on display, as we actually saw the scientist who was performing certain types of medical exams on Jesse Owens when he came back from from beating Nazi Germany at the Olympics, and showing that there are no genetic differences as it relates to intellect, as it relates to physical ability or emotional or psychological temperament. And these are stereotypes and perceptions that run deep in our society, and this is across the world as it relates to relegating blackness. And so to see that on display, a black scientist debunking that, because again, if that was a gene for race, as bad as people have wanted to show racial differences, they would have found a gene for race by now. It doesn't exist, right? Race is only skin deep, and it is a social construction, really invented to actually implement the science of race to be used as a form of economic gain for individuals who are benefiting from slavery, and that has persisted over time. And correspondingly, the prominence of whites in the museum. This is something that everybody should go to. Simply because it's called the African American History Museum and Culture doesn't mean that only black people should go see it. And I was happy to see some whites at the museum, and I hope that people frequent it, because the prominence of whites in the museum was quite on display. There's three I'm going to note. First, I think most people know or should know that Thomas Jefferson, who helped craft the documents that we hold true in our society, actually owned over 600 slaves. So the contradictions embedded in that, I mean, even with George Washington being our first president, I mean, the contradictions embedded in that are quite strong in terms of thinking about what it means, particularly in light of Colin Kaepernick's protest around the meaning of the Star Spangled Banner and the documents that we hold true. Second, Abraham Lincoln, of course, who we crowned for freeing the slaves, he was not a fan of freeing slaves originally. And in fact, took through discussions with Frederick Douglass to motivate him to get to that point. And that was something that the museum really drawed out. Third, actually, a story that I didn't know about is Viola Liuzzo, who was part of the civil rights movement and who was ran off the road. And when she was ran off the road, she died, and some white men were actually charged and found guilty with her murder. And this was one of the only times during the civil rights movement that someone was found guilty, and actually basically the only white woman who was killed during the civil rights movement. So we see that type of display, right? And part of that juxtaposition between the case of Viola Liuzzo compared to, say, black women or black men, I mean, was quite prominent. I mean, from a man being elected as postmaster in Salt Lake City and people burning down his house and his family not being able to make it out of there, to a black woman walking down the street at night and police officers coming by saying they were going to take her home, and instead raped her in the back seat of a car. I mean, a World War II veteran coming back was picked up off the street supposedly for resisting arrest or disorderly conduct, and him and his cousin were beaten and then released and then beaten again by cops, and he did not survive that second round. So I mean, so that form of brutality was quite profound. And it leads to another part. There were some quite profound quotes and images that were in the museum. I mean, that were just so touching and rememberable that, I mean, similar to the other Smithsonian museums, you have to go multiple times. And I mean, since they're free, there's no reason why you shouldn't go. And the final thing, number 10, is that the Black Lives Matter movement is the movement of the 21st century. And it's changing the world, and it's here to stay. And we have to grapple with this. So it's quite interesting that the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was signed by President Bush, mind you, to be put into place, a bipartisan effort, comes to fruition at the end of the term of our nation's first black president, and hopefully on the morning sunrise of our nation's first woman president. And so we see this level of progress, but it also speaks, along with the Black Lives Matter movement, of how far we have to come. So, in saying that, as always, conversations matter like Black Lives in Books, and I hope that this has sparked one, and I hope that you enjoy the images and the quotes that come along with this particular vlog post for the day.